Hi. All right. So that was A Trans with a Movie Camera by director Frances Arpaia. So we have joining us today, Frances, of course, who directed this wonderful short. She also is director of, sorry about that. Let's Go to the Trans Ladies Picnic, Roar in the Dark, and Tomorrow and the Next Day. And aside from her directing work, she has also worked as an independent researcher, most recently on the documentary Disclosure, Trans Lives on Screen. We also have with us today Willow Catelyn Maclay and Caden Mark Gardner, who are co-authors of the upcoming book Corpses, Fools, and Monsters, An Examination of Transgender Cinema. In addition to that, Willow has written for several prominent publications, including The Village Voice, Roger Ebert, Vulture, and BBC Culture, and she also runs her personal film blog, Curtsies and Hand Grenades, which is a great read. You should all check it out. Caden has also written for Film Comment, Mubi, Criterion, and more, and was recently featured on the Criterion channel and at a panel at the Toronto International Film Festival. So Caden, I'm sure you're acutely aware of the lack of positive representation of trans men and trans masculine people in cinema, especially in the mainstream of cinema and TV. And in fact, this very event was supposed to be about trans representation in cinema, but ended up very much being trans feminine leaning. Apologies to all the trans people in the audience, trans men in the audience for that. Can you speak a bit about why you think that may be?
Well, that's it kind of goes into, I would say, a lot of the sort of cis heteronormative perceptions of what is femininity, what is masculinity. And speaking from my own experience, I would say there are a lot of sort of complicated ways in which I have my relationship with masculinity that's very nuanced that I don't necessarily always see on screen. And you kind of see among the trans men I know that they all also have their own sort of nuanced relationships with masculinity. I don't look at it as sort of a competition with trans femmes, but I definitely do think it is based often on uh, cis heteronormative perceptions of us. I would say cis people have don't necessarily think about trans men when talking about masculinity, even on topics of toxic masculinity or idealized masculinity. And that can kind of be very isolating in a way. So it's a very sort of loaded question, but I would just say again, it is often based on those uh, who are sort of moderating and controlling the sort of topics and images more so than whether our community is smaller or less or have less avenues necessarily. So I would again just say, again, that's really not uh, what I would necessarily pin on our communities. It's more of the mainstream.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. And on the topic of who is in charge of who gets represented and who doesn't, um, I know Willow and Frances, you've both done freelance work for Netflix in the past. And we all know that among the major mainstream studios, Netflix has tended less to shy away from trans representation and trans issues. Um, and yet, amidst the controversy surrounding the Dave Chappelle special that came out recently, they've made it clear to our community that their trans-positive facade was for their own gains. However, they have pushed the industry forward in a lot of ways in terms of trans representation. I mean, Disclosure is, of course, a very important documentary, and a lot of their other films with trans actors are like some of the only ones you'll find in the mainstream. So what do you all think about like the sort of representation versus support kind of thing going on with Netflix and other similar studios?
Sure. Firstly, I think the topic of conversation that we have around representation is often a limiting one from my own perspective as a film critic. I don't think it's necessarily good enough or interesting enough for trans people to only appear on screen. I would bring an example of this out to say that Laverne Cox, she's in Promising Young Woman, but that film doesn't have anything to say about transness. So I think that when you're looking at questions of representation on screen, you also have to look at who's behind the camera, who's writing it, who is involved in other forms of production rather than just representation. Because when trans people do more than just appear in front of the camera, when they're behind the camera too, what you end up getting is a language formed out of transness that's more authentic to our own experiences. And I can speak to this for clarity with Frances's films. When you watch Frances's films, you can understand an identity of transness in those movies that you wouldn't necessarily get with something that is extremely in the mainstream, but we're only there to kind of check off a box, which I think a lot of Netflix's stuff kind of falls into that category. And I think other major studios think that that's oftentimes good enough, but it's really not. If we're going to if we're going to like really push boundaries and cross borders with trans representation, you also have to get trans creatives involved. And I think that in the mainstream, it's necessarily not a great place to look for that because they've tokenized transness to a degree in a way that I think is really limiting when you're looking for transness. I think that you'll often see a lot of people who are younger not necessarily look for history in their cinema. And the idea is that the only things that exist in the past were harmful, but I think if you do look into the past, you can find a lot of worthwhile representation. You screened The Queen earlier, and there's a conversation in that movie between the queens just conversing to themselves whether or not they would have the surgery. And, you know, you're going to get more out of that than you would in, you know, a Disney movie that features a trans person in a scene for like 5 seconds.
Absolutely, yeah. Frances, are we getting your audio now? Have we fixed that issue?
So
yes, excellent. We can hear you.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
Great.
Do you have anything to add to what Willow said?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really fascinating. A lot of the things that Willow just said that kind of like touch on both my film and like my experience on the disclosure. On that, I was actually working on it like years ago, well before it went into like production in Netflix. This is when we were doing the initial research phase. It almost entirely just involved watching like every movie we could find that had a trans person in it. And a lot of it was bad. You know, there were some very interesting moments, but a lot of it was bad. Unfortunately, the most interesting things got cut to sort of make way for like a film that was focused on Hollywood, because that's sort of like part of the nature of selling it to Netflix is it needs to have a focus that would, you know, people at home would want to watch. Basically, no one cares about weird foreign films, sadly. But you see in watching these, you see a lot of the same things come up. Like Willow mentioned The Queen and that great conversation where they're talking about whether or not they would want to get surgery. But this sort of like harkens back to this thing I saw a lot where like people don't have the language to like define and understand their own transness. And so you see a lot of people who have different experiences of transness trying to make sense of it with this like lack of language. You see it in like Funeral Parade of Roses. It even comes up in like the Ava Man films, these like Italian exploitation films with Ava Robbins, you know, and it's just a really common thread that you see. It's just like the inability to like define ourselves due to the lack of language, and you know, how we come up with that today and how we like create a new language is something that I've been trying to figure out. And for a Trends with a Movie Camera, a lot of the images you see, like those weren't my ideas. Like when I say collaboratively explorers, I posed a single question to my friends, which is, how would you want to express yourself on film in a way that is not narrative, just like images? And some people want to deal with tropes, and other people had way more interesting things. And then that became a way we come up with basically like a set of foundational images that like reflect our own individual experiences of transness in like really interesting ways. Then I kind of cut them together. So, you know.
Absolutely. And I did want to circle back to the question I had asked, which is about the juxtaposition between very beautiful and very violent imagery in the film, especially sort of the very serene, natural, like green backgrounds and nature sounds and water juxtaposed with the shots of the person throwing, I believe it was an egg at a wall, the other person whipping a pillow, and of course the end, or the scene near the end with all the blood and the vampire teeth. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, so that sort of like reflects this like the breadth of material and experiences that people had, and some people had feelings where that's what they want to do, and it's like I'm 100% for that. It's like being trans is both like beautiful and sometimes deeply frustrating in the society in which we live, and being able to like explore both of those aspects as part of just like everyday life was something that I thought came through really well in the process of making this. And as I was editing it, I found that like this is sort of the most interesting way to approach it, is to look at how images relate to each other regardless of the content, and like think about the sort of like feelings they evoke, and then sort of weave that into this sort of series of like short essay statements, you know.
Yeah.
Can I say something real quick?
For sure, of course. You're all free
Yeah,
to butt in or add anything to anyone else's comments.
Yeah, I think that that's why your film feels as liberating as it does, because oftentimes with trans representation in movies, you will have a situation where one trans person has to carry the burden and the weight of every trans person because there's just not a lot of representation in the first place. But what you do with this collage of transness that I find so interesting is you strip it from its individuality and make it a collective in a way that I think is really emblematic of the trans community on screen, because that's something that we really don't see often in movies. Usually transness is isolated or separated from everyone and everything, but I think our experiences of transness are really communal. Like, trans people, I find, latch on to one another in such a way that it's the only way to survive, really. And I think that that's one thing that's missing from movies about transness for so very long, and one thing that I really appreciate about the films that you've done.
Thank you very much. No, because you're totally right. You see characters as existing in isolation and opposition, like alone within this cis world, but like the reality is like majority of my friends are all trans. We hang out, we have a really lovely life, and it's something I want to express on the screen. And also like the fact that they support me make the films I do has been really charming, and it's just like beautiful and humbling. And it's like being part of this legacy of like being a New York artist, making weird stuff with your friends, and hopefully it resonates with people, and it's nice to hear that. Thank you. So
Yeah, to borrow from your movie, you can't have a trans film movement without cracking a few eggs. And yeah, I hope the audience got that, but yes. To also go back to other questions discussed and brought up by Willow and Frances. Yeah, I'm definitely sort of someone who dumpster dives into even the more unseemly aspects of, I would say, trans images in film, because sometimes the way trans people are even presented in a movie can just be used as such a gag that we can't claim it as part of the whole film or film experience, but of an image, almost an isolating image, as Willow brings up in how transness is used. And you brought up Ava Robbins, and it's like she was in she was in a movie that actually was featured at Cannes that unfortunately got booed at Cannes because it basically had the same type of, the same sort of dodgy representation of a trans person, which is have it be a revelation and have it be something unseemly. It's a movie called Mascara. It should be more well known. It has Charlotte Rampling in it. But I'm also thinking about sort of trying to connect histories together in some of these movies like The Queen. And obviously the most obvious extension would be Paris is Burning because Crystal LaBeija is in it. And you see her sort of run into sort of the systemic and racial topics and issues of that day and also of that setting of the pageant world. And then she obviously is exhausted and personally hurt about her placement in the pageant, but she also instead decides to devote her life to ballroom. And you see that in full bloom in Paris is Burning and also House of LaBeija. So I always think it's important to try to find, and again, sometimes go dumpster diving and try to find some type of buried treasure in that way. But that's also a personal thing I like to do. I know a lot of mileage can vary on that, not just with the language, but also, again, some of the images can sometimes be very violent and triggering. Like, I do understand the limits of people, but I always love trying to mine through what can we find here.
Absolutely. Caden and Willow, you've written a lot, especially in part 7 of Body Talk, your series of conversations on transgender cinema, about the importance of trans people playing trans characters in films. Could you speak a bit to why you think that's important and why you feel that that's vital to trans representation?
Who wants to go first?
Yeah, I'll start. The short of it is that without trans people actually on screen, you can't, I mean, you know, if a trans person isn't actually on screen playing the trans character, then can you really call it a movie about transness, or can you really call the character trans? I think that there's this really limiting notion, particularly of what Hollywood and the mainstream thinks of what trans people look like and sound like and move around the world. And I think that that comes through whenever cis actors play trans characters. I think I often find this at best limiting. There are a few good examples of cis people playing trans characters, but it's extremely rare. I'm thinking in particularly of Karen Black and Come Back to the Five and Dime Jimmy Dean. I think that's a great performance, but you know, can you really say that cis people playing trans characters is okay when there's one performance that's worthwhile out of 500 that are offensive? I think also in a real world context, you get this situation where people get a really corrupted idea of what trans people actually look like. And, you know, for the longest time, people just thought that trans women were like Buffalo Bill and Silence of the Lambs. That's a reality that I grew up with. And when I initially came out as trans, that was the initial reference point that my family had. And while I like the Silence of the Lambs, which is not a commonly held opinion in my community, you know, I carried the weight of that representation over the years. And while I'm hesitant to call that character trans, it had a relationship to real life in a way that did affect the lives of trans people. And I think that even further that 20 years later, it became less malicious and more respectable, which was malicious in its own way. Because then you saw people like Jared Leto and Eddie Redmayne taking up these really prestigious awards performances as trans women, but they don't have anything in common with trans women because they aren't trans women. You know, you had that situation of Jared Leto accepting his award that year for playing a trans woman and saying that he understood the plot of Trans Women because he got a bikini wax. You know, he could never understand these things, and it gives a really distorted view of who and what trans people are. But in addition to that, it's also an issue of employment. Trans people want to be actors just as much as anybody else. And if cis people are taking up all those roles, then trans people have no space to do anything in the mainstream.
Absolutely. I think something interesting as well about, sorry to cut you off, I'll the thing with Jared Leto and Eddie Redmayne is actors like, for example, Scarlett Johansson, who was going to play a trans man in a film a few years back, took those performances and their awards and their accolades as like sort of an excuse to consider it okay. And I think that's an interesting side effect of that. Caden, you were about to say something? Sorry.
Yeah, and to also sort of go back to in relation to my transness, much like Willow, I felt like the sort of burden and reference point I had when coming out was with Hilary Swank in Boys Don't Cry. And I know people do like that performance, but every time I dive deeper into the Brandon Tina story, I just feel less and less willing to even give that film a break, with it being made in 1999 and all of that. But as far as that goes, like, we've seen trans women like Alexandra Billings be open about the fact that she lost out for Trans America to Felicity Huffman, because Felicity Huffman was an Emmy Award-winning actress on one of the biggest shows at that point. And we've seen some actresses who tried out for the lead role in Dog Day Afternoon and got ignored because they wanted someone who wasn't basically weren't as fully into their transition, even though in fact the real life story, Elizabeth Ashley was willing to her transition at that point. It was just that she needed the surgery, so to speak. So again, a lot of this does often feel like distortions, because some of that is also playing with actual real life people. Lily Elby really did exist. Brandon Tina really did exist. But even in stories where it's fictional, it does often feel like that our lives are being used as sort of a prop and sort of this sort of acting exercise for people who want to method it up, so to speak. So yeah, I definitely do see the sort of issues here and feeling like we've come a long enough way where I feel like people should understand that. Although even when something like A Fantastic Woman wins with an actual trans woman in the role, you still have situations like Lucas Dunn's Girl that I absolutely hated and will still bang the drum in really detesting. That film had other problems beyond its casting, but still I also felt like that was also part of the problem there. So I would say, while again, like when doing research for stuff, yes, we run into a lot of these situations of cis actors in these roles, and I do my best not to immediately dismiss them. But again, it is very rare to actually see a great performance necessarily. And I am always curious when people like to bring up what they consider. When I say other people, I mean cis people try to bring up what they consider to be great performances. And it's like, okay, that's interesting, but I don't really necessarily agree. And I try to bring my perspective. Some people are willing to listen and others are not. And sometimes those who are not are unfortunately in high positions who get movies made.
Absolutely. Frances, I know you are very passionate about trans representation by trans people, just based on having seen your film just now. Do you have anything to add to that?
Actually, yes. The point about how all of these people who are being played, all of these trans people who are being played by cis people in movies are like real people. They're our history, they're our story, they're our ancestors. And like, if we're not allowed to play them, then how are we gonna like understand this legacy and this history? It's just like, it's not it's like you can read these stories about people and it's like they're beautiful lives, and we're even denied to tell those stories, like our own history, and it's very frustrating to me. And that's something that like kind of goes back to what we were saying earlier about what it means to not just have like trans actors and trans roles, but also like being able to like tell our own stories and have a foundation that we create for ourselves that's not dictated to us. And yeah, so definitely feel that.
Absolutely. A recurring theme tonight has been the importance of having trans people in producer and directorial and authorial roles. Do any of you have any particular people in mind who are actually like working towards that and doing that work, especially in the mainstream, but in the independent field as well, obviously present company excluded?
I really love Jessica Dunn Robinelli's work, and she also does cinematography and also works in a lot in colors. And I find a lot of her writing also to be very smart and perceptive, and talking about movies that are sort of outside of the queer cinema space. But I really love her work and feel like she should continue, mostly because she kind of bristles at the sort of categorization, and she just wants to make the movies that she wants to.
Keep your ears peeled for Isabel Sandoval. Like, if I was a betting sort of person, I think that she's about to blow up. I think that she's about to end up in the mainstream in a really significant way. She had a film on Netflix recently, Lingua Franca, which I would recommend to everyone in the audience today. If you haven't seen it already, it's a great movie, directed by a trans woman. It stars Isabel. She directed it and wrote it. It's a wonderful movie, and I'm really excited to see where her career goes. She's right now on the precipice of like the independent film world and the mainstream, and I'm really excited to see where she goes next.
Wonderful. Francis, do you have anyone in mind?
It's fun. There's like so often like I'm an experimental filmmaker, and a lot of times like trans film kind of gets lumped into like art house. But one of my friends makes like truly like trashy films where like trans women get to be messy, and that's Dylan Mars Greenberg, and she's been making a number of works since she was young, and she's getting better and better. And if you're into that sort of like really like freewheeling horror, just sort of like they're fun movies. They're really fun movies, and they're just packed full of queer and trans people. So
yeah, and to also actually give titles about Jessica's work. One is So Pretty, which sometimes pops up on like movies to watch on streaming, and Empathy. She also has a short called Marriage Story. But I definitely think she's going to continue making some really awesome and cool work.
Excellent, thank you. Francis, you describe your film as a non-narrative cine essay which collaboratively explores the potentials of trans representation in cinema. And while it is very much in an experimental modality, I do see a lot of documentary spirit about it, especially with the way it was collaborative, with the way you sort of gave your friends and your colleagues these opportunities to just kind of live their truth on screen, and how you were very much sort of not necessarily a fly on the wall, but very well. Of course, I mean it harkens back to A Man with a Movie Camera, from which you got the title, of course, Dziga Vertov. It's experimental, but it's also documentary. Could you speak a bit to the importance of documentary within the field of queer cinema, and sort of how documentary can help with trans representation, trans existence, trans lives on screen, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that like I've struggled with myself is just like being young and not having like the foundation or the language or the information to understand myself. I think that's a thing that still exists for all of us today, and it's like but being able to see people's lives and like know about trans people is something that comes up. And even films that aren't documentaries, it's like you're seeing people who existed, people's lives. Something like City of Lost Souls by Rosa von Braunheim, where you've got this queer community full with a number of trans men in Berlin just kind of living their lives, and it's very relatable. And so even though that's a sort of a fictional version of their lives, it's still in that essence documentary. And when I go out with my friends, it's like we have these moments, I bring a camera, and a lot of it is still performance, we're having fun, but those are our lives. And then being able to see that image is something that like I never got to, and a lot of people haven't. And so even if we're just like hanging out at a picnic or at the beach, or these little moments are in that way like fundamentally foundational to our understanding. It's like a thing that you don't think is possible because you don't have the images to conceive of them. And so documentary is really important in that respect, not just like anything like expose or journalistic, but just like being able to record and see these moments in our lives so other people can see them and understand themselves. And that is like, I think, key to the work I do. So.
Absolutely. And something you said really resonated with me is that even if a story is fictional, it can still be documentary. It can be a document of the time and the place and the milieu in which it was made. And I feel like that's kind of sort of where especially cis actors playing trans people kind of falls short. Like it doesn't document anything. It's not documenting anything. It's all a facade, Do you all have any sort of documentaries on trans people, or just sort of narrative fiction but with a documentary spirit that you would recommend to the audience?
To go off of City of Lost Souls by Rosa von Braunheim, who I love Rosa's work. He's actually a gay man. Rosa is actually in reference to the pink triangle. So it's sort of a very sort of nom de plume by him. He also made other movies with trans people. I know he made a documentary film on transsexual menace, which is unfortunately it's a little difficult to find. And I honestly want to approach Rosa about the availability of that. But he also did a movie with Charlotte von Malstorff called I Am My Own Woman, which I actually never seen any kind of documentary quite like it, in terms of being a hybrid of both biography and autobiography. And Charlotte is almost practically a co-director in that movie. And it's very rare to sort of see an elder trans woman who is still alive, still trying to basically set the own terms of how to tell her story. It's very open about its process, and I find it a really amazing film. I do believe if you might seek out through like German institutes, that you might be able to have someone have access to that, because that's how I was able to find it. But I definitely hope that becomes more available soon, because I think it's a very remarkable film.
One documentary that I would like to point out is this Canadian documentary from the 1980s called Hookers on Davie. It's one of my favorite documentaries on the subject of trans people. It's about these Canadian sex workers, and it really it takes a cinema verite style, but it also has a lot of talking heads in it. But like I really love it because you don't often have a lot of Canadian documentation of transness from that time period in cinema. And I think that this film was available on YouTube last time I checked. But I think in general, documentary is where you want to look for queer representation, because historically that is where queer people have discovered their own cinematic voices. You can even go beyond just transness and take a look at somebody like Chantal Ackerman or Barbara Hammer in the 1970s, figuring out what they wanted to say. And there was this sort of freedom with documentary that allowed for marginalized people to work more freely in cinema. And there's a lot of bits and pieces along the way in film history of trans representation that you would find in documentary and experimental work for that matter, that you're not necessarily going to find in fiction.
Absolutely. Francis, do you have anything to add?
Oh, geez. What can I add? This whole conversation has been nothing but like sweet recommendations of films to watch. I hope everybody's like writing down the titles that have been mentioned tonight.
I'm definitely going to go through the
some of the ones that
transcript.
immediately come to mind were already mentioned. So I don't know. I don't know if I have anything to add off the top of my head right now.
That's all right. That's all right. Paris, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I just wanted to talk about kind of circling back to representation itself, because at the beginning we talked about kind of how there's a lot of good representation, but we don't really hear about it. And my question was not to be conspirator about it, but I feel like when there's a sort of concept that hides itself within history, it isn't because people aren't interested in it, because we can reference the 2020 Hollywood report that came out of UCLA that showed that the representation that we're getting in US cinema and television is at its highest point of having minority characters, and that's across board. But at the same time, there's 500% disparity there that we are not meeting with the demand. So it shows that there's always been a demand for seeing minority characters and trans characters and gay characters, but there's just not been anybody meeting those demands. So my question is that, do you think there are people who stop that representation from blooming when it is good representation, when it is good art, when it is good films? And who do you think kind of pushes back against that? Because I feel like even in today's studios, we are seeing that kind of pushback where a lot of good trans cinema doesn't make it to the mainstream. And I don't think necessarily it's because people aren't interested in independent cinema, because a lot of people are, and that's what the statistics are showing us. So what do you think is happening within the art world and gatekeeping with all of that? Francis, you can kind of start there and then take it from there.
Okay. Well, the sad truth is that like if trans stories are going to be in the mainstream, the way the world is structured now, they have to meet like commercial demands and be marketable and sellable, and it's not, and that's very frustrating, the very real capitalist demands of the film world. And I struggle a lot with this because like I don't want to, a lot of times my films are made with my friends, and I want them to be accessible to people, so I put pretty much everything I make online for free, and that is because I want people to be able to see it. But then there's this sort of like question of its value that becomes associated with that because it is available for free. And there's this like weird sort of like dichotomy that emerges in which like accessibility online and like the amazing breadth of work that's being created by trans creators that is just like on the internet to see is really fascinating. It's never going to cross this threshold into the mainstream because it's not seen as having like value or marketable. It's really frustrating, just like really, really frustrating. And that affects a lot of these things, like right down to the core, just the like hard economic truth of it all that is just like really sad, because people are definitely interested in seeing this stuff. Because again, like a lot of people don't even know, like you just don't have the way to even know that you need to know about the stuff and to understand yourself. But you have to know how to search for it, and it's just very difficult. And I'm not sure how deep I want to get into like an anti-capitalist movie screen right now, so I'll just like roll back.
as deep as you'd like. We are here for it as far as you're comfortable. These are very interesting things. So if you're comfortable, feel free. If not, we'll move on.
I think a good majority of the people here are anti-capitalists, so you're in good company.
There's that Vertov quote about how like the camera and the movie camera as like an invention of capitalism needs to be turned against it. And that's very much part of the work I do, is just trying to like, there's inherent politics to a lot of the work, just because being trans is, weirdly political if you want it, whether or not you want it to be. It's like our bodies are politicized against our will at all times, and they're like subject to these demands of the market, and it's extremely overwhelming. And so I think a lot of the work that gets made kind of needs to be like conscientiously against that, and then also like affects its ability to be sold, and that affects its accessibility and like whether or not people see it or know about it. And it's a weird sort of like way that gatekeeping works through finances and the market. So
that's a really interesting thing to talk about as well, because I feel like there's just this misunderstanding from the studio's perspective when it comes to mainstream and what is marketable and what is in demand. And the misunderstanding there is that if you have trans stories by trans people with trans actors, people are not going to be interested in it, when in reality we are seeing these mainstream successful films that we have mentioned that are acted as though they're like so prestigious and so important, and they have all these amazing accolade. And that's the interesting part, because there are a lot of films that have proven that there is demand and that they can be successful, but still there's this misunderstanding just is there, and the resistance is there. So why do you think that is? Or like, where is it coming from? Because it no longer feels like something that is based in economic fact. It is rather something that is based on an idea or prejudice or what have you, because the reality of it is that a lot of people are interested and a lot of people are going to the cinema and willing to pay to watch these films.
I just think that unfortunately the industry for the last 10 years has kind of been sanitized to the point where it's only just Marvel movies and then maybe a medium budget movie that can hopefully win 10 Oscars. And as far as those options, I don't necessarily think that we always have to seek industry respect as far as box office or in accolades, because sometimes our audience doesn't necessarily want what the mainstream wants, because clearly based on the grosses, I haven't seen a Marvel movie in the last few years, and even before that last Marvel movie, I didn't see a Marvel movie for several years before that, but clearly people are seeing those movies. So it's a very sort of like miss me with sort of wanting what, say, the mainstream wants necessarily. But as far as wanting to see more trans people on screen, yes, I definitely still believe in movie going in 2021 post-pandemic. And I would like to see films that aren't just screened at queer film festivals be able to break through. But unfortunately, the way the industry has kind of eaten itself by its own tail, it's a little difficult to kind of necessarily see a pathway. Unfortunately, I'm not an economist, so I can't really give a forecast of what to do next after that point. I definitely think artists like Isabel Sandoval and a few other people do have what it takes to sort of make films that have these sort of very accessible, but not compromising sort of negotiations with how to film trans bodies to sort of break through. But at the same time, again, I'm like, I don't really like Hollywood at this point. I've kind of turned my back to sort of wanting to see a quote unquote Hollywood movie, because it really doesn't look like anything I was sort of growing up with. Like, I don't really see the same sort of promises of seeing a trans person have the kind of trajectory of a Todd Haynes, so to speak, doing new queer cinema to the point of making movies that were nominated for Oscars, unfortunately, because it was a different Hollywood back then.
I think
And,
that
go ahead, Willow, sorry.
yeah, it's okay. I think that I think that we need to remember that this idea of trans people being accepted in the mainstream is a very, very new one. You know, it's only when I came out 10 years ago, it's night and day to what it was if you came out today. Things still aren't great, but you know, it's a relatively new phenomenon of transness sort of dipping its toe in the mainstream a little bit. And I think because it's a relatively new phenomenon, I think that there's a conflict of interest. I think that the people in charge are still hesitant about trans people because they have a lot of ingrained socialized beliefs about who and what trans people are. You're seeing how easy this is to weaponize over in the UK right now, where their mainstream publications are being ripped to shreds basically by a fringe movement of people calling themselves feminists who are dubbing all trans women as rapists. I think that cis people take it for granted that that couldn't happen where they live, but I think that it absolutely is, because we don't have a sturdy foundation of cis people actually interacting with trans people on a level of like the day to day. You know, like it's a really difficult proposition, and I think when it pertains to cinema, I think that we're a very long time away from seeing any sort of coherence where transness can be just interjected into the mainstream and be honest. I think that in order for transness to be in the mainstream, it has to be compromised in some way. Lily Wachowski's Matrix sequel is coming out in a few weeks, and she's a trans filmmaker, and that film is going to probably do huge numbers, but if it has anything to say about transness, it'll be smuggled in. It'll be dipped in metaphor. It won't be obvious. It won't be in your face. It won't be actual trans people on screen, because it can't be, because the mainstream doesn't trust that sort of representation yet, because not enough time has passed. They don't know enough trans people. You know, this is an industry that's still actively hateful towards LGBT people. And this goes beyond just not trans people, but, you know, people who are gay as well. You know, the versions of queer cinema that you're getting right now are very sanitized compared to what you were getting in like the 1990s. So you get these movies about like, you know, trying to assimilate more often than not. And I think that assimilation is not something that's necessarily on the minds of a lot of trans people, because we've been shown that assimilation is a brass ring that's held in the air, and it'll keep getting raised higher and higher no matter what trans people do.
Absolutely. And you mentioned the Matrix sequel. It's kind of fascinating to think that the first Matrix film, released in 1999, more than 2 decades ago, was also very much steeped in trans metaphors through and through. And the fact that here we are 20 years later, trans lives are purported to have been accepted at least somewhat in the mainstream, and yet this blockbuster science fiction movie still can't have that representation on the surface level. It still has to be hidden behind metaphors and all played by cis actors, etc., even though it's directed by an out trans woman.
Yeah, I think that's something that you have to think about. You know, this movie's coming out in 3 weeks, and how much discussion have we heard about, you know, the fact that this movie is being made by a trans woman, the fact that this movie is going to be huge probably, but you know, no one's talking about that element of it, because it's ultimately not going to matter in the movie, I don't think. Like, I haven't seen it, I can't say, but you know, I would be very shocked if there was anything outwardly, literally about trans people in that movie.
Absolutely. We've talked a lot about the sort of anti-capitalist ideology and how important it is to look outside the mainstream and outside the capitalist Hollywood sort of means of film production. So January 1st is actually International Public Domain Day. So Queer Film Club is going to be hosting a special screening of specifically public domain films. Can you speak a little bit to the importance of the public domain, the copyleft, and sort of other like film movements and film art outside of the sort of mainstream capitalist narrative?
I mean, I first saw Paris is Burning on YouTube. And it was for many years up until it got restored by Criterion, a very hard find for whatever reason. And again, like it's difficult to me to think and sort of rationalize how a film that is dealing with a lot of people of color who are very marginalized and are clearly not always getting the most first access to a lot of the sort of tools and needs of living, let alone seeing any sort of form of entertainment, how you could make something like Paris is Burning and then unfortunately, due to the powers that be, not have that be reachable, often have it and other trans movies sort of be stuck in ivory tower academia. Like I obviously do love institutions, especially like UCLA does great programming, but I sometimes wish that they would consider making these things more accessible, especially because the subjects themselves, would you not want to see yourself in that space of and being able to access it? So I definitely do believe and hope that especially institutions do understand making their works more accessible, because I can't think of being able to do a lot of this research without often finding these movies as rips on YouTube.
Yeah,
Just
absolutely.
sorry, Leah,
Go
just
ahead.
speaking of accessibility makes me think of something that Willow just mentioned about like having a sturdy foundation for trans representation. And that makes me think that oftentimes it so happens that we talk about how art is going to be accessible, and that is a huge problem for a lot of people because we just don't have good access to it, to understand it or to view it or to what have you. But as artists and as, you know, critics and writers and filmmakers, do you think that oftentimes as someone who is an artist and also is trans, you have had to make the spaces for your voice to be heard because they just don't seem to exist? And if you have, do you think there is other space, or do you feel like that is your experience, that is something your experience is? Because I know there's, you know, the website that you have or the other platforms that Frances is using, for instance, to have her films there. How do you interact with this kind of gatekeeping or this feeling of not wanting to assimilate to a system that wants everybody to look the way that heteropatriarchy wants it to look?
I mean, Caden and I decided to do Body Talk together as a self-published project because we didn't want to compromise what we wanted to say. So it's always something that we wanted to discuss whenever we talk about transness. We didn't want to put this in the hands of somebody else who didn't necessarily understand where we were coming from.
Yeah, when we started, I don't think we really knew any trans editors to begin with. And I do think that has changed in the years since, of actually knowing people who are published or have some sway in the written criticism community. But yeah, we did that basically due to our frustrations with not only pitching and not getting published, but also just being able to be free of any kind of intervention or editorial oversight by people who we still often have to explain the languages we're even using and bringing up and what sort of context and proof we have.
Absolutely. Go ahead, Francis. Sorry about that.
I think it's definitely challenging when it comes to, as like a filmmaker trying to get your work out there. Um, Content restrictions is a big one. It's a real like neo-Puritanism that's starting to emerge in terms of like what you can and cannot do. And it's all about like companies not wanting to have to like deal with people getting mad at them. So it's still just a bottom line thing. And I definitely struggle with that with the work I do, because you know, being queer, there's an element of sexuality one wants to explore and express on screen, and like being able to do that and like find spaces to do that is really hard. You know, Vimeo makes, that's the platform I use for most of my stuff, and they say they make artistic allowances for like nudity and stuff, but that's definitely been a struggle. Of like what somebody who is not trans, who is like trying to make a decision, is as to what is artistic. And I've had friends who've been banned from there. I've had friends who've been banned from Pornhub for the work they do, you know? And it's just genuinely frustrating, because it's like, you want to express these things and you want to have a platform for them, but there's this sort of like way in which they are kept. You know, I've had trolls flag my work and other people's work just because it's trans work. That's all that matters, you know? That's enough to sort of like have it be an issue. There's a number of sort of like video art shit posts, I would describe them as, on YouTube, that are like 10-hour long videos of just like loops of trans women kissing. And those definitely got flagged by trolls, and I was told they were inappropriate. And I had to like age restrict all of them, even though there's no nudity. It's two adults consensually kissing each other. That is controversial, age restricted content that has to be like locked away, you know, because you can't have anybody see queerness, even in like the most like sanitized, like neat form of just like two adults kissing, you know. So, you know.
Unfortunately, that's also part of the history of just telling trans stories. Like, there were so many early trans memoirs that immediately got put in adult bookstores. And most of those were pretty sort of what we would call the sort of standard memoir template of the before and after, so to speak. But because it was about transness and talking about surgeries, it's immediately got flagged by people and decided to put it into spaces that had actual pornography.
So
Yeah.
we touched, sorry, Paris, did you have something to say?
No, it's just I was just thinking about censorship. Sorry for cutting you off, because
No
it's
problem.
really
Go ahead.
interesting when platforms that are supposedly supporting all of these artists who have nowhere else to put their work want to censor them in this way. And it's like something as big as people stopping your work from being published, people flagging your work, reporting it, putting it, taking it down. And it could be something as silly as saying that anything queer needs to be moderated. Because I remember for our emails, if you have the word queer in your email, you just get flagged. And if you put up a video with the word queer in it, you just get flagged immediately. And it's just kind of like, why is it that within just media as a whole, there has to be like this idea of censorship and moderation? Like somebody has to always be there playing the morality police to make sure that you're not saying anything that you're not supposed to be saying, just because what you're talking about could be LGBTQ in nature. I find that extremely strange and mind-boggling.
Thank you. So we are going to wrap up pretty soon. It's getting a little bit late over here in Vancouver. I mean, not Vancouver, my lord, in Montreal. Sorry about that. But I wanted to ask you all, each one by one, what is your favorite trans film of all time and why?
My favorite trans film is Funeral Parade of Roses. I said as much the other day on my Twitter account. If you, I don't know. My Twitter handle is @Willow Catelyn, but like I love Funeral Parade of Roses because it's not just about representation. It's about this breaking down of form between documentary and fiction in a way that forces itself to create a new language of its own in a way that I think is really necessary for trans cinema. And I think that with Funeral Parade of Roses, you do see in that movie the way that the camera is moving, the way that the edits are placed, the way that the structure is done. It feels trans in nature in a way that's more than just representation itself. It's also in its own cinematic form and language. And I think as I grow older and more experienced with queer cinema, what I want out of trans cinema in particular is a language. I'm not just looking for representation. I'm looking for movies whose form feels trans, not just having trans people show up. That's obviously important, but I think that the filmmaking itself needs to be trans. And in Funeral Parade of Roses, it is.
Absolutely. I just have one interesting thing before someone else jumps in. I'm noticing now that in the live captioning on Zoom, trans keeps getting read as trends. And I'm wondering if that has something to do with sort of societal transphobia, that trans, I'm going to say trans, yeah, see, even if I really enunciate it, it still says trends, and it's clearly just the word trans is not in the dictionary of the Zoom live transcription. I find that very fascinating.
And
Maybe we should just bring back transsexual.
I
There's
mean,
no
sure.
getting around that. We know exactly what it is.
I do use that word to be provocative sometimes.
I'm going to try saying transgender. Okay, that one works. Trans, no, though.
To answer the question, my one is a kind of recent favorite, and unfortunately very difficult to find. I discovered it during the pandemic when Anthology Film Archive actually had virtual screenings of it, and it's called it's by Jeff Priest, who did a lot of camera work and has directed features. It's called Stop, where it's basically a silent collage of basically years and years of his sort of home movies. And basically what happens is he films his child, who then basically, without sort of any sort of text provided to sort of fill you in, you just see the images where he comes to terms with his trans masculine identity, and by the end he is fully a trans man. And I thought that was like a very beautiful sort of presentation that is very uninvasive, and you can tell very loving sort of relationship of a father and son. And definitely one of the better times I've sort of seen trans masculine images on screen, for sure.
Absolutely, thank you. And Frances?
I got a second Funeral Parade of Roses. That movie's amazing. Incredible movie. It touches on a lot of things we talked tonight, both like fiction and documentary, the sort of like politicization of the body. A lot of that stuff is shot in the middle of the Todai riots, the student riots that were happening, the protests that were happening in 67. And there's this whole concept of like trans bodies as being part of this political movement that is kind of baked into the film. It's really, really very good. There's really nuanced discussions of identity despite the lack of language, like contemporary language. I mean, it's just a great movie. And if anyone hasn't seen it, they really, really should. So.
Absolutely, and not to sound like a bandwagoner, but I have to third Funeral Parade of Roses. It's definitely my favorite trans representation in cinema of all time. My favorite trans film. Just all around one of my favorite films. So anyone who hasn't seen it, check it out. I'm sure we'll end up screening it at the Queer Film Club at some point.
Yeah.
So just before we wrap up, do you all have any upcoming projects you want to plug, or social media you want to plug, or articles, or anything you want to plug? And if you could send them to me in an email afterwards, I'll share them with the crowd.
My discussion with Michael Koreski for the Queer Sided program, which does include a couple of trans films, both nonfiction and fiction, that include Fassbender's In a Year of 13 Moons, which might be a little hard to watch, but also the nonfiction, The Salt Mines, its sequel, The Transformation, and Come Back to the Five and Dime, Jimmy Jean. Basically, I did the most feel bad slate of queer movies, but at the same time, I also had the most trans movies to talk about. So that's still on the Criterion channel, the movies and the discussion.
Thank you. And I know you also, you're also the voice behind the Corpses, Fools, and Monsters Instagram account. So anyone who's interested to hear more from Caden should definitely go follow that account. Willow?
I have nothing on the immediate horizons. I'm the sort of writer who just does whatever comes to me in the moment. I have no set schedule. I pitch a lot, but I'm all over the place on the internet. I'm sure if you Google my name, you will come up with a million articles I've written for various websites over the years. I have a Patreon where I do a lot of self-published writing these days. If you are interested in learning about that, it is available in the homepage section of my Twitter account, which I think I mentioned earlier. I do most of my writing over there these days because the film criticism world, the economy of it kind of is on the verge of collapse. And I'm self-published and having just other people pay for access to my writing at the moment. I hate doing the paywall thing, but it's the circumstances that I currently find myself in.
It's worth it. She's a good read. Follow her on Patreon. Be a patron. Support a trans person.
Thank you, Caden. And Frances, do you have anything you'd like to plug?
Sure. Like Willow, I have no real set schedule to the stuff that comes out. I have maybe a million projects in different states of completion. I'm literally sitting in my office right now, like surrounded by strips of film. So this is sort of like the nature of the mess and the work. But I did shoot a feature in October that should be done next year. Another like wild, like low budget, me with a camera and two people, sort of like bizarre love story told through letters. I described it as a reflections on an epistolatory constructed self, and that should be done sometime next year. So, more longer form work for me, I guess, is coming out, more like narrative stuff. So
that's very exciting. Please keep me posted on how that goes. We'd love to premiere it at the Queer Film Club.
Cool.
So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. This has been really wonderful. And if we could get another quick round of applause.